Great. Well, welcome everybody today to our last panel to finish out the day here at the Annapolis Book Festival. We'll be talking about living in the age of artificial intelligence. So I am very pleased. My name is Cara Lapointe. I'm a senior fellow at Georgetown University, and we have the great pleasure to have Amir Husain and Paul Scharre with us today. So we'll be talking a little bit about the emerging role of artificial intelligence in society. So Amir Husain is an award-winning serial entrepreneur and inventor, as well as the founder and CEO of Spark Cognition. He's the author of The Sentient Machine, The Coming Age of Artificial Intelligence. And Paul Scharre is a senior fellow and director of the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security. He's a former Pentagon official and an Army Ranger who is a veteran with multiple tours to Iraq and Afghanistan. He's the author of Army of None, Autonomous Weapons, and the Future of War. So we're going to start off today by giving each of the authors here a few minutes to talk about their book and talk about their view and how they frame the idea of artificial intelligence in society, both in terms of civil society and military. So we'll start with Amir.
Well, thank you very much, Cara. It's absolutely wonderful to be here in Annapolis. It's actually my first time, and it's a wonderful city. As far as the motivation for the book, for The Sentient Machine, when I wrote the book, the concern that I had was that I couldn't see much in literature that approached the topic of artificial intelligence from a truly philosophical perspective. There are, of course, many scientific and technological aspects that one must consider. But at the same time, this idea came to me that artificial intelligence and the advent of artificial intelligence, in fact, could be seen as a mirror unto society. Many of the problems, many of the existential concerns that we worry about, for example, will these machines with great powers and great skills, will they be able to undo us? Will they kill us? Which is the Terminator scenario, if you know, from the famous Hollywood movie. But then beyond that, will these machines that can now perform all forms of labor, almost all forms of labor that humanity has taken millennia to master, will this mean that our economy will crumble and that there won't be any jobs for us to do? And so I realized in many of these discourses, the reaction was always one of, these machines are denuding us. These machines are taking something fundamental away from us. If you think about over the last many centuries, even the way that we name ourselves, we have last names like Porter and Farmer and Goldsmith. We are so invested in the economic labors that we are capable of performing that we confuse this skill with some intrinsic value. And when we are told that, look, beyond the horizon, this skill of yours may not be very valuable, that creates some sort of an inherent angst. So with those questions in mind, I set about looking at the sentient machine in two ways. One, very practical, really talking about what artificial intelligence is doing right now. And the one difference that I may bring to this book is that everything I talk about, almost everything I talk about in the book, I'm involved in building that. So Spark Cognition is an artificial intelligence company based in Austin, and almost every collaboration with London Stock Exchange, with the US military, with State Street Bank, with large hedge funds, with large power generation companies, the largest utilities in America and Europe, all of these things that run through the various chapters of the book, providing vignettes on what artificial intelligence can do. These are not just second-hand in my case. We build them. So we have a pretty good idea of where these things are going. And based on where these things are going, both in the political and military sphere, as well as, frankly, just as an existential question, I think it will become impossible for societies, countries, polities, individuals to not understand artificial intelligence and to not deal with the idea of a synthetic creation surpassing humanity in many ways, and a synthetic creation doing for the first time things that we thought only human beings can do. Because this attacks the very root of our ideas of soul and free will and so on and so forth. So these were the two discussions that I attempted to balance in the book. The very practical, what's happening now, what are we building now, and then the philosophical underpinnings. And I'll save the conclusion of the book for maybe a subsequent question. But one of the chapters in the book, actually two chapters, really focus on where artificial intelligence is being applied to warfare. My colleague, General John Allen, who's a 4-star retired Marine Corps general, him and I worked over many years, and about 2 years ago we published a piece in the US Naval Institute Proceedings Journal called On Hyperwar. And from that, this whole idea of what hyperwar is in the modern age came about. So that has been captured in this book, as well as much of what we hear today now about our election being hacked and Cambridge Analytica and so on. So the book also talks about these threats and also talks about how we can mitigate these threats also by using AI. So these are just some of the things I've covered in the book. I'll stop here and maybe give Paul an opportunity to talk about his book.
Well, thanks, Amir. You've given us a lot to delve into. But Paul, if you can talk about Army of None and on the military side.
Thanks. I'm Paul Scharre, author of Army of None, Autonomous Weapons and the Future of War. And what Army of None digs into is the issues that Amir raised kind of at the end about what artificial intelligence means for conflict and warfare. That's entirely the focus of the book. So we're in a world today where 90 countries have drones, including many non-state groups like the Islamic State. And 16 countries, and this number keeps going up every month, already have armed drones. So they're already weaponized. And one of the things we see in science fiction, like the new season of Westworld just came out, is that a lot of our visions for where this is going is that we build these more intelligent machines, and then we have these fears that someday they'll turn against us. What we're seeing in the real world is actually increasingly advanced robotic systems are being born with a gun in their hands. We already have these armed systems, and each generation of them, they're becoming increasingly autonomous, much like automobiles. So you get into a top-of-the-line car today, and many of them have features like automatic braking, self-parking, intelligent cruise control, automatic lane keeping. Same thing in military systems. With each generation, they have more autonomy, more intelligence. What the book grapples with is what happens when a predator drone has as much autonomy as a self-driving car. What are we willing to delegate to these machines when we're talking about life and death decisions? So the first half really digs into what our military is building around the globe. It looks at the United States. It's got interviews with researchers at DARPA and the Pentagon and the Office of Naval Research. It looks at what Russia and China and Israel and other countries are doing, and how some of these systems, what you see both deployed and then in research labs, where they're kind of taking us right up to this threshold of this ability technologically to cross this line and allow machines begin to make their own targeting decisions on the battlefield. Right now, humans are still in control of sort of deciding about who to attack, but a lot of these technologies that are being innovated would allow someone to just flip a switch or install a software upgrade and take the human entirely out of the loop of this decision-making process. And then the second half of the book really deals with, well, what does that mean? Looking at the law of war, and what those criteria are, ethical principles, different ethical arguments people have made both for and against the technology. There are, I think, are obvious reasons. I think a lot of people don't have to look very hard to imagine reasons why this might be a bad idea. Certainly, there are plenty out of science fiction and pop culture. But there are arguments that people have made for these kinds of weapons, and they draw upon analogies like looking at self-driving cars. The idea being, well, just as automation in automobiles might reduce accidents and save lives, could there be ways that machines in warfare could make better decisions than humans and could spare civilian lives? So that's one of the things that I grapple with in the book. And then I look at concerns about stability and interactions between states. When you look at something like stock trading, we actually have a domain now of stock trading where most of the trades are done by machines, are done by bots. And we've seen accidents that come from that, things like flash crashes, where these unexpected interactions between algorithms lead to sort of these horrifying catastrophes. And in stock trading, what they've been able to do is mitigate these challenges by installing what they call circuit breakers that take the stocks offline. if the price changes too quickly. And that's a way to manage the problem. It doesn't stop these problems, but it reduces them from causing too much trouble. But there's no one to call timeout in war. There's no referee. And so what happens if there's these interactions, these autonomous weapons interact, and there's a flash war? How do we deal with that problem? And then the end of the book deals with the history of regulations in warfare. There's an international effort underway led by non-governmental organizations and in about 24 states now, calling for an international treaty to ban these kinds of weapons. And I look back at the history dating back to ancient India and attempts to ban poison and barbed arrows, and attempts by the Pope to ban the crossbow in the Middle Ages, which was not very successful. Up through the modern age to try to talk about, how can humanity deal with some of these technologies, and are there ways to come together to cooperate to avoid some of the most harmful outcomes?
Thanks, Paul. There's certainly a lot to think about in there, and you bring up kind of some of the things that people are definitely afraid of, right? And Amir, if I can turn back to you, one of the things you say in your book is you say that we are starting our contemplation of AI from a place of existential fear rather than one of opportunity, right? Can you delve into a little bit in terms of what are the real opportunities that we have in society with AI?
Sure. Let me actually start from the point of fear. There's two very important things to really think about there. One, like I said, artificial intelligence for me personally has been a mirror. It's allowed me to understand myself and dynamics in human society better than at least I thought I understood them previously. And, we're all aware of cognitive biases that exist in human brains. We think something, but the reality suggests something different. We make mistakes. So our brains are also subject to cognitive bias, and sometimes, and in books, multiple books that have been written on this subject, like Thinking Fast and Slow, there's a huge list of such biases that are described, and you can actually just read the book, and the author plays tricks on you and says, well, think about this, and then asks a question, and you realize you made the wrong call. It's an easily confused mind. So that exists within humanity. So there's something to improve there. The point is, this is a pretty big gap, and there's something to improve there. The second reason for this fear is that, we think that artificial general intelligence, and here I'll define two terms, artificial general intelligence being the kind of AI that is human or human plus level AI, that can solve general problems. It can learn anything like a human being can. It can be athletic, it can sing, it can read books, it can compose poetry, it can drive a car, it can do all the things that humanity does and then some. General intelligence. Artificial narrow intelligence is where we are right now. So the systems that my company builds, or what Google and Amazon build, they all fall into the domain of artificial narrow intelligence. Within a certain domain, these systems can actually outperform human beings. For example, a computer program has beaten the world's best Go player, the world's best chess player, the world's best Atari game player, right? So within certain domains, we can completely obliterate human performance with these artificial narrow intelligence programs. But they are just what they were made for. They do some learning, but within that domain, they're very narrow. Now, that alone has the ability to impact the economy in a very substantial way. For example, there's a Price Waterhouse report that came out about the UK economy, which is similar in terms of its sophistication. And their view is that in the near term, like by the early 2020s, there'll be about a 2 to 3% reduction in jobs in the UK due to automation. But by the mid-2030s, just about 15 years later, that number will rise to 30%. And for this, we don't require commander data from Star Trek. Okay? We just require narrow intelligence, the kinds of systems we're building now, self-driving cars and self-driving farm equipment and turbines that predict when they're about to fail, so you need less technicians, and aircraft that 30 minutes before they land, they tell you exactly what's wrong with them, and then one maintenance tech comes up with an iPad and looks at a list of step by step exactly what to do to fix the aircraft. No thinking involved. By the way, that system we built in partnership with Honeywell. So these things are already out there. This is all narrow intelligence, and it's making a difference. So these are positive things on the one hand, and they have an economic component on the other. In other words, what should that truck driver that's had a pristine career, that's never had an accident, is now in his mid-50s, and he's worked hard all his life and done an honest job. And we look at him and we say, you know what, technology's arrived, autonomous trucks are here, too bad. I think you should go back to college and maybe get a chemical engineering degree. We need to re-educate you. It's not, that sort of a way of thinking doesn't jive with a fundamental understanding of who we humans are. There's mental plasticity that changes over time, and you can't treat somebody like that in society. If you want to create a stable society, you can't do those things. So the real challenge is that delivering the benefits of automation and AI through many of these things that I described, in healthcare, in green energy, in better efficiency, in getting people out of hazardous situations like Fukushima, there are a litany, unending list of things that these machines can do for us. But what that is connected to is today we have human beings performing that labor. So immediately the benefit of getting a human being out of that loop is immediately connected to, oh, you're taking somebody's job away. So the solution isn't to ban the technology. It isn't to stop progress. The solution is to come back and say, what is value? Value beyond the needs of the human flesh is essentially human agreement. We agree now that rap music is very valuable, and people that sing rap music make a lot of money. Or people that can hit a baseball out of the park should make a lot of money. Or an athlete that runs or jumps at a certain level of performance should make a lot of money. But if you went back 500 years, these weren't the collective agreements of society. So value in these cases is purely a consequence of the agreement of society. And if that's the case, it is something that can free us in developing new models, evolved models, where we are able to compensate people not just for what we call labor today, but compensate them for things that we didn't think were valuable previously, but really are valuable. What are those things? The book gets into quite a bit of detail. In a nutshell, they are our unique perspectives, our ideas. That ultimately is what we bring to the table. So the question is, how do you take an amorphous thing like an idea and a perspective, and how do you create a monetary system around that? And that's some of what the book explores also.
That's great. And I want to go back to what you're talking about with artificial general intelligence versus artificial narrow intelligence. And Paul, I want to jump to you, because a lot of what people think about when they think about military and they think about artificial intelligence and autonomous systems is what they learn in popular media. They think about Skynet. They think about Terminator. Can you help us kind of walk through what's myth versus reality in terms of what do AI and autonomous systems actually look like today and in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could almost start with the assumption that anything in science fiction is just sort of myth when it comes to this. I mean, what we're really seeing is increasingly advanced robotic vehicles. So boats, aircraft, drones underwater, ground vehicles. These are most advanced in the air or underwater. It's particularly challenging on land because of just the difficulties of navigating around obstacles on the ground, and a lot of the things that make self-driving cars possible, like GPS or the ability to map the environment very well, those things may not exist in a military environment. Many of them don't look like what we would think of as robots, though. So they look like advanced missiles. So next-generation missiles that can adapt in flight to their target, that can move around enemy threats, that can talk to one another and coordinate their actions, so swarms of intelligent missiles. And they also, of course, look like cyber weapons, which don't look like anything, but have tremendous effects. There's just an incredible program that DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, ran a couple years ago called the Cyber Grand Challenge, where they brought together competitors to build these computers that could scan software all on its own for vulnerabilities that could be then either hacked offensively or they would patch them defensively. And these computers competed in basically a tournament, a capture the flag sort of tournament, to find these things. And they were able to do this all on their own. And they're now at the level where they're not as good as the top human hackers in the world, but they're in the top 20. which is pretty good, and is enough to have a lot of value in military operations. Like the Pentagon's already deploying this technology to improve its own software, to patch it up. So all of these things, though, are things that they're not intelligent like us. They don't understand sort of the broader context for what they're doing. They can act with great precision. When they're being used in the way that they were intended, they can be quite reliable. But if the environment changes somehow, and they're not prepared for that, they can't see the bigger picture. And that's where a lot of the risk can come from, which is you can build these things that they work very, very well, they do exactly what they're programmed to do, or exactly what they were taught to do. But then if the situation changes a little bit, they don't understand that the war has ended, or this person might be a civilian. They don't understand maybe the environment has changed. And that's one of the concerns about some of these weapons.
So to dig into these concerns a little bit, right? In your book, you do a really balanced job of talking about all the reasons why we may want to leverage AI and autonomous systems in military context, but also all these fears that we have around it. So let's think about what really is the moral issue that's at the heart of all of this?
I think the central moral question that people are trying to grapple with is, how do you use technology in a way that might be beneficial without losing our humanity in the process, without losing the human role in warfare? So I'll give a story about my time in Afghanistan that might illustrate this. I was in a Ranger sniper team relatively early in the wars, and we're up on the Pakistan border in a hide site. And the sun came up. We'd infiltrated at night onto the mountaintop. And the sun came up, and there's not a lot of trees in this part of Afghanistan. So it turns out the rocks did not give us quite the cover we realized, we were hoping for. And it was pretty clear that the village beneath us saw that we were. And it wasn't very long before a little girl came out. And it was clear that she was sent out by someone to scout out our position. She had a couple goats behind her, but she wasn't obviously herding the goats. She was looking at us, and she was reporting on us. She had what we later realized was a radio on her. She was reporting back to her position. And she came up, and she kind of walked this long circle around us. She's maybe 5 or 6. She's not particularly very sneaky. She's like staring right at us. So we watched her, and she watched us. And eventually she left, and it wasn't long after before some Taliban fighters came. So we took care of them, and the gunfight that happened sort of brought out the entire village. It was pretty loud, and eventually we had to exfiltrate. It was pretty clear that the village was more people growing in a crowd. And later on, we were talking about, well, how would we deal with that again? So we talked about, okay, if we could, we would try to maybe, if there was a civilian that we saw up on the mountain herding goats or something, we would come up to them, we'd see if we could, grab a hold of them, pat them down, see if they had a radio, if they were reporting on us, so we would know if we were compromised or not, if someone else, the enemy fighters would know where we were. I can tell you one of the things that never came up was the idea of shooting this little girl. It wasn't a topic of conversation among the people there. What's interesting is that under the laws of war, that would have been legal. The laws of war do not set an age for combatants. They determine your combatant status based on your actions. So if you're participating in hostilities, if you're scouting for the enemy, you're an enemy combatant, and it would be legal to kill you. So if you built a robot to perfectly comply with the laws of war, it would have shot this little girl. And she's participating in hostility. It's not her fault. She doesn't know any better. She's been sent by someone to do this. And I think that would be wrong morally, but it would be allowable under the law. So this is the kind of challenge that humans, in this case, intuitively understand. And there are other situations in warfare that people might face that are, I think, much more difficult, actually, that weigh very hard, competing, tough moral choices. And what do we, I think the fundamental question is, do we want to enter a world where humans are no longer making those decisions, where we've handed them over to machines? And what would that mean for warfare, or what would it mean for us if we did so?
I think this idea of human judgment, right, and the ability to intervene in machines making decisions, this corresponds into the civil space as well, right? Amir, you in your book talk about lots of examples where their AI can really help society, but you also talk about some of the existential issues with it. So how do we go about regulating and starting to mitigate all of these potential negative concerns while not squashing the innovation and letting AI and autonomous systems help us do all the things we need to do in society?
You see, there's two things. One, I think in general, if you look at it in very objective terms, if you look at it in things like HDI, Human Development Indicators, the fact is that an increase in the wellness of humanity broadly across the world is correlated with the development of scientific and technological progress. There's very little argument in that. So the overall thrust is heading in the right direction, and artificial intelligence is not just an area of work. Artificial intelligence is the area of work. It now underpins new innovations and discoveries in a broad range of sciences. So attempting to curb or stop or drastically reduce the amount of effort that people are able to apply to artificial intelligence will be disastrous, I think, for scientific progress. Now, what Paul talked about, this is obviously a very difficult moral call. I'll tell you another difficult moral call from, again, the book that I was citing earlier, a lot of research that's been done, judges in Israel that were adjudicating cases of folks that were up for parole. And there was a temporality, there was sort of this timeliness to whether they would accept or deny the cases. Around noon, they would start to have a very high rate of rejection. In the morning, it was high. It tapered below, and then after 1 o'clock, it started to increase again. And after the psychologists involved did a study, they discovered that this was because the brain requires glucose in order to think through hard decisions. And when the brain lacks that glucose, we default to fast thinking, system one thinking. And so the default in this case was just let it go. Whatever the status quo is, just let it go. And the implication of that little bug in the human brain, that little deficiency in the human brain, is ruining dozens and dozens and hundreds of people's lives. So this is just one example. With every cognitive bias, there are issues and concerns like this. So I think on both sides, we will find examples that are absolutely terrible. One of the things that I say is that I don't worry about the malevolence of a machine that does not exist at a level of sophistication to where it can exhibit malevolence. I worry about the malevolence of man. Ultimately, all of these systems that exist today, nuclear weapons, all of these non-intelligent systems, if you will, that are completely controlled by human beings, there is a fundamental existential risk posed by them too. So given that balance, there are many examples of what Paul is talking about. There are many examples on the other side as well. I don't think that that alone qualifies us to stop or curb or end development in this area. And the other part, which is my last comment on this, is that during the time of George W. Bush, he imposed a ban on stem cell research in the United States. Some of you may remember that. The consequence of that was that China became the largest genetic sequencer in the world, and this year, close to 100, if not 100, several dozen human stem cell experiments were carried out in China. They are now the leader in that space. So what I mean to say by that is that if you decide you're not going to do something, it doesn't mean that thing won't happen. So then the question is, if you can't guarantee by you not doing something that the thing won't happen, then it's not a simple decision. Then you're in what's called game theory. This is sort of the prisoner's dilemma. There's two people that have to make a decision. There's a perfect good outcome, but no two parties have perfect information about each other's motives. And so by assuming that the other person is doing the right thing, you lose. By taking a middle course, you gain. And so the optimal decision never really happens because nobody can assume that the other person who's not communicating information to them is doing the right thing. This is the problem with nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, you can fly a satellite, you can fly U-2, SR-71, drones, whatever, and you can photograph large areas of land where big nuclear reactors are being built. So it's easy to tell a country, you're running a nuclear program, and you agreed that you wouldn't, and now sanctions or whatever the payback is. But how can you verify that in an entire country, in every computer connected to or present in a country, some lines of source code aren't present? It's a fundamentally unverifiable activity. Artificial intelligence is not a big building. Artificial intelligence is not a large aircraft or parked in a hangar. Artificial intelligence can be lines of code that I might have in my pocket right now on a $5 USB disk. And there is no way to validate the lack of presence of such technology in a country. So that creates the situation where you have to assume that it's there. And when you assume it's there, I think that kills the whole idea of a ban. You can't ban it then, because the folks that shouldn't be having access to this technology probably will behind closed doors.
And I want to follow up with that in a second, but I do also want to invite any audience members who have questions. We have a microphone in the middle, so please feel free to use it. So I want to follow up on this idea of the inevitability of using AI, but at the same time, this lack of transparency when AI is even used, right? I mean, we hear a lot about the black box issue of not really understanding what's going on inside algorithms, but often we don't even know when they're being used. So how do you start to deal with this?
The malevolence comes from human minds. And I'll tell you that if you think about, this is my position on it, I've said this before. For example, social media has caused a lot of harm recently. In terms of individual privacy, in terms of being able to become a platform for entire elections to be hacked, and many other documented things that they've done. The solution is to, so how does that happen? That happens because you're connected to a number of people. Those people post news, updates, so on. But you don't get to decide what you see. There is a Facebook algorithm or a social media algorithm in the middle that sits there and decides. You can't directly influence that algorithm. Why? Why is it not possible to give you complete control over that filtering algorithm? And this is the deep question to ask. Because if Facebook's model is ads, that's one thing. But if Facebook's model depends on fundamentally understanding your psychology to such a deep extent that they are unwilling to give you any control to be able to change the filter that they've created to target you, that is far more dark than just trying to optimize the sale of an ad. And the solution of this sort of a problem is democratize the algorithm. Give the algorithm away, give the algorithm to the user, give control of the algorithm to the user. So yes, this is, I'm not asking for a ban on social networks. I think that ultimately technology, once it's out of the box, you cannot put it back in the box. But there are fixes, there are things that we can change. Sorry, there was a question.
That's helpful. Yes, ma'am.
So I don't know if you address the social consequences of all of this in your book. But it occurs to me listening to you today that my father's prediction to me when I was 11 years old in 1965, and he brought in a mini computer into our home and said the world will never be the same again, and we're not ready for the consequences, is really true. So first we saw the hollowing out of the middle class as technology changed how we manufacture things and how we grow food. And it seems to me that as AI comes more into the world, that it is going to profoundly change how professionals who see themselves as part of the upper middle class work, and whether or not they're able to work, and how many we actually need to work. And so you said at the beginning that we need to figure out how to value something else, but we have never had a society, at least as far as I'm aware of in humanity, where we have rewarded for people for anything other than work. And so if we don't need as many people to work, what do we do with them?
Yeah, that's the multi-trillion-dollar question. There are lots of, on the practical side, there's lots of proposals. You've heard about universal basic income, you've heard about a robot tax. There are concepts around going back to the basic concept of rent. Each one of us owns a bit of earth as a human being, and rents accruing from what is ours on earth. That can be a way to provide us with funds. My own suggestion is what I call idea coin. I don't mean this to be a literal piece of currency, but the idea is that we are connected on a network already. We contribute ideas that may be valuable to other people, And as people find value in these ideas, a design, a painting, whatever that happens to be, some idea, other people's judgment of how valuable they find sets a value to that particular concept. And because I anticipate that on a system like this, there will be both AIs and human beings operating at the same time, you could argue that, well, the fastest AI will just take all the good ideas and will take all the money away. So in this system, I've also proposed embedding a logarithmic reward function. In other words, for the first good invention you make, you get 10. For the next one, you get 8 and 7 and 6 and so on, so that this kind of issue that we have in finance capitalism now, where there are no holds barred, massive collections of money, because money wants to collect in one place. It's sort of like Gollum's ring. And in that sense, this logarithmic function can, to make that fundamentally part of our economy, I think can mitigate that effect. There will still be rich and poor, because we don't want to make everyone equal. It takes away incentive. But I think what we can do is we can say, look, when this thing gets absolutely into its extreme edges, this logarithmic function can really prevent that from happening. So I'm not suggesting to you that that solution has occurred. What I'm worried about is that the governments aren't even properly talking about this. What's happening today is that you have Russia thinking about this primarily on the military side, China more holistically, France somewhat holistically, but with a small amount of money. Dubai, I was there 2 weeks ago and I met with the world's first AI minister. So they've gone and done that. But here in the United States, there's still a lot of work to do. Paul and I both serve on an AI task force that CNAS established with Deputy Secretary Bob Work and many other notables in the space. We're trying to get something going, but it's not at the level of Xi Jinping talking about a 2030 strategy. We don't have that level of traction. So we can find a solution, but I think we're behind the times, even behind other countries.
Sir?
Good afternoon. I had a question where you spoke about, the question of whether AI has malevolent ends or not. And I was wondering more about sort of the gray space of unintended consequences of things doing exactly what they are supposed to do, or how to sort of split the difference. You think about, I think it was Target had a sophisticated AI that correctly predicted a 16-year-old girl was pregnant before her parents knew and started sending, baby notifications. Or you think about, or you think about autonomous cars and how they handle the infamous trolley problem. Is you're going to crash, and do you hit the bus full of nuns or the orphans, or do you save the driver? And how do you go about doing those things where it's not clearly there's a right or wrong, but there's a middle ground that even all of us in this room wouldn't necessarily come up with the same answer about. And
Sure.
Similarly in the military sphere, is it enough to put one person in the middle of the kill chain and we've satisfied the moral necessity, or is it something else entirely?
Paul, do you want to start out?
Yeah, I mean, certainly putting a person there just to push a button or be a scapegoat is not an effective solution. I mean, we've seen examples in the military context where there have been people in the loop, if you will, in highly automated lethal weapon systems, and we still have accidents if the humans surrender their judgment to the machine. If they engage in automation bias, another type of cognitive bias, where people over-trust in the automation. And so what we really are looking for is humans to be actively engaged, to engage in this sort of a slower type of thinking, understanding the context, and for humans to feel morally responsible for the actions that then occur. You don't want a situation where the humans say, well, I'm just here to push the button, the machine's doing the work. There were two fratricide incidents in 2003 where a U.S. air defense system, the Patriot, shot down 2 friendly aircraft. And humans were in the loop for those. They pushed the button. And afterwards, when investigators interviewed the operators, one of the things they said was that their belief was that if they overruled the automation and they were trying to target sort of Saddam's missiles, Scud missiles, that was the intent. If they let a missile come in and people died, then they would be in more trouble than if they just trusted the automation and they just said, go ahead and do it, and there was still an accident. So that's a place where it's not just about what we design, but how we use it, and then how we train people and the culture that we put around these systems to ensure that humans still ultimately feel responsible for the decisions that are made.
Amir, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, look, I'll answer it. Paul gave you a fantastic answer. Maybe I'll answer it from a different angle. And that is that, I often think about where we are in terms of improving human nature. And you can ask me what is improving and what is human nature. But look, even now, my belief is, this is just my belief, that we here in America are blessed with a lot. Geography has been so incredibly kind to us that if we start to enumerate just the blessings of our geography, it would fill a book. And in fact, Robert Kaplan just filled a book with exactly that. So we have a lot to be thankful for, and our situation is not the average situation across the world. Now, we could have been somewhere else. We could have been born in a place, or we could be living in a place where there are lots of stresses. What I've observed generally is that man, women, when subjected to stress, start to lose the higher level functions of their brain and start to degenerate very rapidly and very quickly. The reason why I am interested in autonomy and artificial intelligence is because I feel that short of reprogramming humanity's brains, the only way to create a better world is to reduce the amount of ancient stresses that cause us to activate the reptilian part of our brain and start to act like a snake or some other form of malevolent reptile, which we do very often, and we've done worse. So that, whether that proves to be true or not, in social engineering, we've seen that happens. We say that, look, people in richer countries, and I'm just loosely using language here, so forgive me, in richer countries, people generally behave better. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean that being richer makes you a better person, or because you're in a certain part of the world? I've traveled the world, I can tell you, there are wonderful people everywhere. What makes people better is when they know that they have food on their table, that there's fundamental security, that nobody's coming after them and banging down their door in the dark of night, that their children have a future. There is very consistent reactions to that kind of security. So using automation and using AI to build that kind of security, by the way, that's what Buckminster Fuller many years ago had argued for. He said technology has already arrived at a juncture where we can take care of our population, we can supply them with what we need. Now it is our choice that we don't do it because we lack the political will. We used to go and dump grain in the ocean because we wanted to keep the prices of grain high, as opposed to factoring in that if I gave this for free to some part of the world that needed the grain, could that overall reduce anxieties, reduce the negative behaviors, create stability, and maybe plant the seed of a new vivacious society that could one day become an economy and could one day become a customer. So this is a way of thinking, and my way of thinking is that our best bet is not the politicians. Our best bet is not, self-styled messiahs. Our best bet is science, technology. A lot of people working on a lot of science and technology, because through history, science has proven to be a friend of man. And that's my view.
Thank you. Ma'am?
Hi. First of all, thank you for being here. This is all super fascinating. I actually have a few questions, if that's okay. But I'll cede the floor if anyone else wants to ask any. I guess the first one I want to ask is around the difficult choices you mentioned that maybe might remove some psychological toll on those people. And I'm thinking in particular with regard to policing in America right now. It's become very clear, especially of late, that bias plays very heavily into the decisions that law enforcement makes, and maybe AI would be a way to alleviate some of those conditions. But the problem that I have with that is that the group of people who are programming AI is not very diverse. And right now we're seeing that on a comical level with, like, hand dryers in bathrooms that don't recognize people of a certain skin tone. And I am wondering how you would address that in situations where you're creating AI for something like law enforcement or anything where it has to deal delicately with situations like that, where the bias of the person who programmed it may cause it to essentially malfunction in a given situation. How do you account for that? How do you remedy that?
Yeah. Do you want to tackle it?
Yeah, I'll quickly give you an answer. The issue sometimes is not just about the bias of the programmer. Most of the current machine learning techniques being used are supervised learning techniques. In other words, they give you, you require thousands, millions of examples that are labeled of some object in some state, maybe an individual of a certain ethnicity or an animal or a door or whatever it is, with a label. And you require a large number of those in order to properly train the model. So the issue is not actually getting a broad enough set of data. When you're talking about images that are human images, the quality control problem manifests itself as poor recognition for certain types of ethnicities. But this fundamental problem it goes beyond just faces. If you hadn't trained pictures of enough doors, it wouldn't recognize a door pretty well. So I think this is quality control and more data. The programmer isn't actually programming any rules here. The programmer isn't going in and saying, if these things are true, then it's Caucasian male or a black female, or all those decisions are being made by a neural network that has been trained by data. So I think, again, better quality control and much more data. And we need to demand that.
So I think you've got a layered set of problems. A lot of the problems are about, as Amir talked about, you have this set of training data, you train a machine on, and then you apply it to the real world, and it's a different distribution of things that you're interacting with. So maybe if your training data doesn't have enough people of ethnicities or something, right, in the real world, your system doesn't know how to identify them properly. Another problem might be that and sometimes it's not that the programmers are trying to be bad or themselves are biased. It's that, yes, that simply you have bad data. Another type of problem might be that the goals the programmer sets. So there was an interesting article that a journalist did recently looking at YouTube videos. And what she basically found was that as she started watching YouTube videos of a certain type of content, she started initially with political content. YouTube started recommending more inflammatory content. So initially she started watching, like during the election, videos of Donald Trump on a campaign rally giving stump speeches. And then eventually it started recommending more extremist right-wing kinds of speeches and like sort of really extreme, like neo-Nazi kind of stuff. She thought, oh, that was crazy. So then she creates a separate account, starts watching Clinton videos, and then started recommending a bunch of extremist left-wing material. Then she created another account, started watching just jogging videos, and started teeing up ultra-marathoning. So there's something about the algorithm that starts teeing. Now, why is it doing this? Or suspicion is that it's trying to maximize the amount of time you spend watching YouTube for advertising purposes. And the algorithm has simply learned that people tend to click on more inflammatory types of content, regardless of what it is. So, here's the situation of the goals also matter. Who's designing the system? What are their goals? In this case, their goals are to sell ads, right? And then how does that get instantiated in the way the machine learns? So I think that there's a whole range of things. Some of these are, though, about when we're living in this world where these tools are being built by a small subset of people and they're affecting all of us. And the tech community is not very diverse at all, right? Looks very white, looks very male. And then, of course, being driven by corporate interests, you get a whole range of other societal problems that come as a result.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. So we have a gentleman in the back who has a question.
Yes, this question has to deal with the social aspects of AI. And Mr. Husain, you had mentioned that by the 2030s or thereabouts, a large percentage of at least the U.S. population won't have jobs that they have today. given that our federal government earns most of their tax revenue from income tax, from our labor, how do you see in the future federal government, at least our federal government, earning a large portion of its revenue? Do you see possibly a robot tax, or what?
Sure.
Can you discuss that?
The statistic that I gave of 30% unemployment was from a Price Waterhouse report about the UK in the 2030s. But the US number is actually even worse. So, but just a minor clarification there. My view is that there's going to be a few different ways to sort of compensate for this. And I'm not suggesting that all of this can be compensated, but here's what I'm thinking. I think that as we've migrated towards services, and within services, a lot of caregiving type professions now employ a lot more people than they used to. I think that trend is going to continue. There's going to be a lot of personal services, caregiving, things that we always want human beings to do because they're associated with the human touch and they make us feel better. The other thing that I find, and you'll see this even on YouTube, so many people now are YouTube content creators. So many people have big Instagram channels and they monetize those Instagram channels. I mean, these were jobs that didn't exist before. Now, how many are there? I don't know, but I can tell you that the independent coder, the programmer who doesn't work for a company and can live anywhere in the world, running through companies like Elance, for example, and Odesk and companies like this, can earn hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of foreign exchange for their countries. All these stats are out there. So there's some democratization of work, federation of work that's already happening. There's some types of jobs that we'll always want people to do. Healthcare is another big one, right? In fact, the doctor will probably be mechanized before the nurse. Now, how will we make up the difference? I think where we make up the difference, the things that have been talked about for a while that are already being experimented with. One is universal basic income, which is in the Scandinavian countries, and I believe in Iceland also. Can you give $10,000, $15,000 as a base income? The country has some fundamental assets. Different countries have different assets, but the US, as we were talking about, is the richest country in the world, and I don't mean that in terms of the dollars we have. I mean that in terms of the natural gift that we've been given. So, focusing the discussion on this country, there are things to monetize, there are resources to monetize through machines that we can share the bounty of that automation with individuals. So a reverse tax, or you can look at it as a robot tax that's then yielding resources back to humanity. The idea coin concept that I talked about is another one of these concepts which could lead to something. So there might be 5, 6, 7, 8 of these proposals that come about, and some will be shot down. But ultimately, the fact that some of them are already being tried gives me some hope. The Emiratis in the UAE, they're also very, very forward-looking. They're also thinking about ways in which they do things. And their environment is very different. They're not Scandinavia. Their environment is very different. So it's good. They'll come up with other ideas. And over the next 5, 7 years, that's what we have to do. Technology has outpaced policy innovation. And now is the time for some policy experimentation. The world is a lab, and let's figure out how we can come up and try a lot of these kinds of economic policies that might work.
So there are a range of predictions on sort of what automation will mean for the future of work. I do not think, and there are sort of anywhere from people predicting depression-era level unemployment to people saying there'll be so many jobs created by AI that we'll all be millionaires or whatever. The best analysis that I have seen is by a work by McKinsey that basically said roughly half, 46%, of tasks being currently done in the US economy are automatable with existing technology. Now, that's not actually whole jobs. That's tasks that people are doing as part of their jobs. And it's only a very small fraction of jobs, less than 5%, that are entirely replaceable by machines. You can see some of them, things like toll booth operators, the person taking your ticket when you have a parking garage, but most jobs will see some disruption. And so you'll see some tasks being eliminated, handed over machines, but then of course new jobs created. Now what does that mean net? The best work on this I've seen by Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee in The Second Machine Age. They argue that automation has already been responsible for the suppression of median wages in the United States. So you're seeing a sort of slow decline of median wage for many people, particularly for lower skilled or lower educated workers. That automation picks up routine physical and cognitive labor, and that's generally been performed by people with less education. And so particularly for people with like a high school education, we've seen a really stark drop-off in wages, most difficult for them. We've done some work at the Center for New American Security. This is not in the Army of None, but we've done some work there that'll be coming out later this summer, where we've looked at this automation data and compared it across demographic categories in the U.S. economy. And it shows that a lot of these actually fall on the youngest people in the workforce. So we tend to think when we think about people in their mid-50s, that this hits them because it's hardest for them to adjust. That's going to happen, obviously, to some people. But the bulk of it's going to land on people in sort of that are starting to enter the workforce because they have the least amount of education. The good side to that from a societal standpoint is there are those who are most, in the best place to adjust, who have the most time. The challenge is that we need to have education policies, things like affordable college education, to make it possible for them to get a good education to do so. And in particular, if you're thinking about people who are using that lower income job, the lower skilled job, to pay their way through school, one of the things we're doing is we're taking away that step ladder they're using to get educated now. But there are, potentially policy solutions that could help mitigate that.
Well, Paul and Amir, I want to thank you for a very interesting conversation today.
Thank you.
You've given us a lot to think about, and I have 30 seconds to give to each of you to give one last thought you want to give to the audience as we walk away.
Want me to go first?
Go for it.
Okay.
I gotta think of something.
Yeah. I think it's this idea from the Sentient Machine, which is that a lot of people worry that as computers become faster and they can think everything, then there's no value of the human mind. And consider that the landscape of ideas is infinite. There are infinity ideas for machines and humans to go and discover. So regardless of the speed of any machine, they will discover about as much of the ideascape as we will, which is almost nothing. So what matters when speed doesn't matter is really perspective. And that's the reason why we continue to have intrinsic value as human beings, regardless of how fast the machines think.
Thank you. Paul?
I think on a similar line, sometimes we get caught up in, is the machine better than humans at this or that? One of the questions that I like to ask in a variety of domains is, if we had all the technology we could imagine in the world, what would we want humans to be doing and why? And what types of decisions are ones that we want humans to make in our society? And why do we think that's important?
Well, perfect. And with that, I would say thank you to our panelists and thank you to the audience.
Thank you.
And that wraps up Book TV's coverage of this year's Annapolis Book Festival. Now, if you missed any of the events from today, you can watch them tonight beginning at 12:30 a.m. Eastern Time.